You've got your bug out bag. You've got your rural retreat location. You've got your maps and your routes and your plans. When collapse comes, you're leaving. Getting out of the city, heading to the woods, bugging out to safety. This is the plan. This is what every prepper guide tells you to do. This is Preparation 101. And in 4 out of 5 collapse scenarios, this plan gets you killed. Not because you prepared wrong, not because your supplies are inadequate, not because your location is bad, because bugging out itself is the fatal decision. The act of leaving when you should stay. The choice to become a refugee when you should remain in place. The strategy that seems logical but leads directly to your death. Prepper culture has created this orthodoxy around bugging out. Have your bag ready, have your location prepared. When things go bad, execute your evacuation plan. It's treated as universal truth, as the default response to any collapse. But it's not. It's a specific strategy that works in exactly one scenario and fails catastrophically in all the others. Understanding which scenario you're facing is the difference between surviving and dying as a refugee on a roadside, between making it through collapse in your home and getting killed trying to reach some retreat you'll never arrive at, between staying alive and becoming a statistic. Here are the 4 collapse scenarios where bugging out gets you killed, the one scenario where it saves you, and how to tell the difference before you make the decision that ends your life. Scenario 1. Economic collapse. Refugees starve while residents persist. This is the scenario where the financial system implodes. Currency becomes worthless or hyperinflates into uselessness. Markets crash, banks close. The entire economic structure collapses, but the physical infrastructure mostly persists. Power still works, water still flows, buildings still stand. It's the economy that died, not the grid. This is what happened in Venezuela, in Zimbabwe, in Weimar Germany, in Argentina during their crisis. The money stopped working, but civilization limped forward in degraded form. People still lived in cities, still had homes, still had some semblance of social structure, just without functioning economy. In this scenario, bugging out is suicide. Here's why. Your rural retreat requires economic activity to sustain you. Unless you're completely self-sufficient farmer, which almost nobody actually is, you need to trade. You need to participate in whatever economy emerges. And economies concentrate in population centers, not rural isolation. You bug out to your retreat, thinking you'll live off your stockpiles and your land. Your stockpiles last maybe 6 months if you're extremely well prepared. Then what? You can't grow enough food to sustain yourself unless you're an experienced farmer with established systems. And you're not. You're a suburban prepper who took a weekend permaculture course. Your garden fails or produces inadequately, and you're starving on your rural property with no way to acquire more food. Meanwhile, the people who stayed in cities are participating in the new economy. They're trading, they're working, they're accessing whatever aid exists. They're part of economic networks that emerge from the collapse. Currency might be dead, but barter works, skills work, labor works. The economic activity that sustains life is happening where people are concentrated. You're isolated on your retreat with nothing to trade and no one to trade with anyway. Your nearest neighbor is miles away. There's no economy in rural isolation. There's just you and your failing garden and your depleting stockpiles. You're slowly starving while city residents are struggling but surviving through economic participation. And you can't come back. You abandoned your home. Someone else is living there now, or it's been stripped. Your connections in the city are gone. Your place in whatever economic structure emerged is taken. You're returning as refugee to a place that's moved on without you. You have no position, no resources, no network. You're worse off than if you'd never left. The strategic error is thinking economic collapse means infrastructure collapse. It doesn't. Economic collapse means the money system failed, but civilization continues in degraded form. In this scenario, you need to be where economic activity is happening. That's cities and towns, not rural retreats. Your bug-out plan took you away from the economy you need to survive long-term. What you should do instead is stay put. Defend your home if necessary, but stay in the city. Develop tradable skills. Build economic relationships. Participate in whatever barter or new currency system emerges. Your survival depends on economic integration, not isolation. The person who stayed and adapted economically outlives the person who fled to rural isolation and starved when their stockpiles ran out. Scenario 2. Pandemic collapse. The roads are disease vectors. This is the scenario where disease drives the collapse. Not just a bad flu season, actual plague-level mortality. Something that kills fast and spreads easily. The Black Death. The 1918 flu at pandemic scale. A disease that's breaking down society through depopulation and fear. In this scenario, bugging out is how you get infected and die. The act of traveling is exposure. Every person you pass is potential disease vector. Every rest stop is contaminated. Every interaction is infection risk. You're trying to reach safety, but the journey itself is what kills you. Think about what bugging out actually requires in pandemic. You're leaving your home where you can control exposure. You're traveling through areas with unknown infection rates. You're potentially using public routes where thousands of other people are also fleeing. You're stopping for gas or supplies at locations where infected people have been. You're creating countless opportunities for exposure, and you're stressed. You're scared. You're not sleeping well. You're eating poorly during travel. Your immune system is compromised by the stress of evacuation. You're more vulnerable to infection precisely when you're maximizing exposure through travel. This is how disease transmission works. High exposure plus weakened immunity equals infection. Your rural retreat might be safer from disease once you arrive. Lower population density means lower transmission. But you have to survive the journey, and the journey through pandemic is where infection happens. You're passing through or near population centers. You're exposed to other travelers who are fleeing. You're touching surfaces, breathing air in enclosed spaces if you're in a vehicle. Every mile traveled is another opportunity for disease to find you. Meanwhile, the person who stayed home is isolated. They're not exposing themselves to countless potential carriers. They've secured their home. They're limiting contact to zero or near zero. They're waiting out the pandemic in place with minimal exposure. Their strategy is isolation where they are, not isolation somewhere else that requires dangerous travel to reach. And here's the critical point about pandemic collapse. It ends. Not quickly. 6 months to 2 years typically. But it ends when enough people are dead or immune that transmission stops. The pandemic is temporary, even if it's catastrophic. Traveling during a temporary crisis that will end is trading safety now for marginal safety improvement later. It's not worth the exposure risk. If you're already at your retreat when pandemic starts, fine. Stay there. But if you're in the city when it starts, stay in the city. Isolate in place. Don't travel through infection to reach isolation. You're just giving the disease opportunity to kill you during the journey. What you should do instead is lock down immediately where you are. Quarantine in your home. Stock enough supplies to avoid going out for weeks or months. Create isolation protocols for anyone entering. Wait out the pandemic in the place you're already at, instead of traveling through it to reach somewhere else. The journey kills you. The isolation in place saves you. Scenario 3. Infrastructure collapse. The grid fails, but society holds. This is the scenario where physical infrastructure fails, but social structures try to persist. Power grid goes down from cyber attack or EMP or cascading failure. Water systems fail. Transportation networks break. Communications go dark. The technological systems that enable modern life stop working, but government and social organization are still attempting to function. In this scenario, bugging out separates you from aid and puts you on the worst routes at the worst time. When infrastructure fails, help concentrates where people concentrate. Government aid, emergency services, community organization, resource distribution. All of this happens in cities and towns where population density justifies the effort. Rural areas get abandoned or deprioritized because helping 10,000 people in one location is more efficient than helping 10 people across 10 locations. You bug out thinking you'll be self-sufficient in your retreat, but infrastructure failure means your retreat probably doesn't work. No power for your well pump, no fuel delivery for your generator, no supply chain for replacement parts when equipment breaks. Your infrastructure-dependent retreat becomes non-functional when infrastructure collapses. You planned for grid-down living, but you didn't account for how dependent your systems were on supply chains and fuel delivery. And you're missing the aid. Cities are getting water tanker deliveries, getting food distribution, getting medical services, getting whatever help exists. You're not getting any of this because you're miles from anywhere aid is being delivered. You left the city to be self-sufficient, and now you're realizing you're not actually self-sufficient, and there's no help where you are. The routes are catastrophic during bug-out. Everyone's trying to leave cities simultaneously. The roads are gridlocked. You're stuck in traffic with no fuel and no way to get more because gas stations don't work without power. You're a stationary target in a vehicle on a highway with no options. Or you're on foot covering maybe 10 miles a day if you're in good shape. Your retreat is 100 miles away. You're not reaching it. You're becoming refugee on the road. And you're vulnerable during travel. No infrastructure means no law enforcement. The routes are where predators operate. Checkpoints, ambushes, robbery. You're traveling with supplies through areas controlled by people who have nothing. Your mobile target advertising that you have resources. The journey is more dangerous than staying put because you're exposed and predictable. Meanwhile, the person who stayed in the city is part of the community organizing in the absence of infrastructure. They're participating in water distribution, they're in the aid networks, they're cooperating with neighbors for security. They're worse off than before collapse, but they're surviving through community support that only exists in population centers. What you should do instead is stay in the city and become part of community resilience. Join or form neighborhood groups. Participate in resource sharing. Provide skills or labor to the collective effort. Your survival comes from being part of organized community response, not from isolated rural self-sufficiency that probably doesn't actually work without infrastructure support. Scenario 4. Social collapse. Rural areas become war zones first. This is the scenario where government collapses and social order breaks down, but infrastructure might still be functioning. The state fails. Law enforcement disappears or fragments into gangs. Courts don't operate. There's no legitimate authority. Armed groups form and compete for control. It's warlords and militias and gang territories. Social collapse, without necessarily infrastructure collapse. This is what happened in Somalia, in parts of Syria, in Liberia during civil war. The government was gone, but buildings stood and some systems worked. The breakdown was social and political, not infrastructural. And in these collapses, rural areas became more dangerous than cities, not less. In this scenario, bugging out takes you from relative safety into extreme danger. Cities fragment into territories, but those territories have some stability under whoever controls them. Gangs or militias or warlords establish control and then maintain it. There's brutal order. Not good order, but order. Predictable violence in service of control. Rural areas are ungoverned space. too spread out for any group to control effectively, too low population to bother governing. This makes them operational space for armed groups that don't control territory, bandits, raider groups, militias using rural areas as base of operations. The lack of control that seems like freedom is actually maximum danger. You bug out to your rural retreat thinking you'll be away from violence. You're actually moving directly into the area where violence is least constrained. No one controls rural routes. Armed groups operate freely. They're running checkpoints on roads to rob travelers. They're raiding isolated properties because there's no one to stop them. They're using the countryside as base because cities are controlled by rival groups. Your isolated retreat is perfect target. You can't defend it alone. You don't have the numbers. The armed group that finds you either kills you for your supplies or forces you out and takes your property. You prepared a retreat for yourself and you delivered it to whoever was willing to use violence to take it from you. And you have no allies. You're alone in rural isolation. When threat comes, there's no one to help. No neighbors close enough to matter. No community to call on. You're completely on your own against groups that operate with numbers. This is how isolated rural properties get overrun. There's no defense against organized groups when you're alone. Meanwhile, the person who stayed in the city is part of a territory. They're under the control of whatever gang or militia or warlord took over their area. It's not freedom, but it's survival. They're cooperating with power. They're providing value or tribute. They're part of structure that provides some security in exchange for obedience. They're not free, but they're alive. The city territories are actually more stable in social collapse because they're controlled. The groups that control them need the population. They're extracting resources or labor. They maintain enough order to keep their territory functional. Rural areas have no such incentives. There's nothing to extract, no population to control, just space to operate in without opposition. What you should do instead is stay in the city and navigate the power structure that emerges. Become part of whatever group controls your area, or at minimum, don't resist them. Provide value. Keep your head down. Accept that you're living under brutal authority rather than no authority. Controlled violence beats uncontrolled violence. Cities and social collapse are organized crime. Rural areas are chaos. The one scenario where bugging out saves you: environmental collapse. This is the only scenario where bugging out is correct strategy. Environmental collapse, where your current location becomes uninhabitable. Not temporarily, permanently. The environment itself has changed enough that staying means death. Sustained drought that's permanent. Rising sea levels that are flooding coastal areas. Temperature changes that make regions too hot or too cold. Nuclear contamination. Chemical disasters. Anything that makes the physical environment at your location incompatible with human survival. In this scenario, staying kills you. The environment is the threat, and the environment isn't leaving. You can't defend against it. You can't adapt to it. You can't wait it out. It's permanent change that makes your location lethal. Leaving is the only option. This is why bug-out plans exist at all. They're designed for environmental threats that require evacuation. Nuclear plant meltdown, chemical spill, wildfire, flood. Situations where the location itself is the danger and moving away from the location is survival. But environmental collapse that justifies bugging out has specific characteristics that distinguish it from other scenarios. The threat is location-specific. Moving away from the threat eliminates the danger. The threat is immediate or imminent. The window to leave is closing. The threat is permanent or long-term enough that waiting it out isn't viable. In this scenario, you execute your bug-out plan. You leave immediately. You go to your predetermined location that's outside the affected area. This is what the plan was always for. Environmental threat that requires evacuation from current location to safer location. The key is recognizing when you're actually in environmental collapse versus other collapse types. Most preppers assume any collapse is environmental collapse because that's what the bug-out plan addresses. But environmental collapse is actually rare. Most collapses are economic, or social, or infrastructure. Environmental collapse that requires evacuation is the exception, not the rule. How do you tell the difference? If you can point to specific environmental threat that makes your current location uninhabitable, you're probably in environmental collapse. Radiation, floodwaters, fire, drought that's killed all water sources, specific physical environmental danger, that's environmental collapse. If the problem is economic or social or infrastructural, but your location's environment is still habitable, that's not environmental collapse, that's something else. And in those scenarios, bugging out kills you rather than saves you. How to recognize which scenario you're in before you make fatal decision. The most important skill is scenario recognition in the first hours or days, before you execute your bug-out plan, before you commit to leaving. You need to correctly identify which type of collapse you're facing because the right response varies completely between scenarios. Ask yourself these questions. Is the physical environment at my location becoming uninhabitable? If yes, bug out. If no, stay. Is this economic collapse where the infrastructure still works, but the financial system failed? If yes, stay in population centers where economic activity will concentrate. If no, keep evaluating. Is this pandemic where disease is the primary threat? If yes, isolate in place immediately. Do not travel through infection to reach somewhere else. If no, keep evaluating. Is this infrastructure failure where systems are down but government still exists in some form? If yes, stay where aid will arrive. Don't separate yourself from help. If no, keep evaluating. Is this social collapse where government has failed and armed groups are taking control? If yes, stay in population centers where territorial control will emerge. Don't flee to rural areas that will become war zones. The evaluation happens in the first days. You're gathering information. You're watching what's failing and what's persisting. You're assessing the type of threat and the likely trajectory. You're making the identification before you execute your plan, because executing wrong plan is worse than having no plan. And here's the critical insight. Your bug-out plan should be primarily for environmental threats. That's the scenario it addresses effectively. For all other scenarios, your plan should be shelter in place with specific strategies for economic, pandemic, infrastructure, or social collapse. Bug out is the backup plan for the one scenario, not the primary plan for all scenarios. Why prepper culture gets this wrong. The bug out orthodoxy exists because it's dramatic. It's exciting. It's the apocalypse movie scenario. Loading up the truck and heading to the mountains. Becoming rugged survivor in the wilderness. It's fantasy that's more appealing than the reality of staying put and dealing with economic adaptation or community organization. And it's marketable. The prepper industry sells bug-out bags and retreat properties and tactical gear for evacuation. There's entire economy around bug-out preparation. This creates bias toward bug-out as default strategy, even when it's wrong for most scenarios. Bug-out plans also feel like taking action. You have a bag. You have a destination. You have a plan to execute. This feels more prepared than stay home and adapt to circumstances, even though the latter is correct strategy for most collapses. The visible preparation feels like better preparation, even when it's preparation for wrong scenario. And there's ego investment. People have spent years preparing bug-out retreats, thousands of dollars on remote property. They don't want to hear that their preparation applies to only one scenario and fails in 4 others. They've committed. They can't psychologically accept that they prepared for wrong thing. So bug out remains orthodoxy, despite being wrong most of the time. The brutal truth about refugees. Here's what happens to people who bug out in the wrong scenarios. They become refugees. And refugees die at catastrophically high rates compared to people who shelter in place. Refugees are on the move, which means they're exposed. They're burning calories. They're not getting adequate food or water. They're sleeping poorly. They're stressed constantly. Their health deteriorates rapidly from the conditions of being displaced. Refugees are vulnerable. They're on routes everyone else is using. They're visible. They're targets for robbery or violence. They have no defensive position. They can't secure themselves while moving. Their maximum vulnerability. Refugees lose everything. They left with what they could carry. That's not enough for long-term survival. When they arrive at destination, they're depleted and exhausted. If they don't arrive at all, they die on the route with their bug-out bag and their preparation and their plans that led them into refugee status. The person who stayed in place isn't a refugee. They're resident. They have position. They have resources they couldn't carry. They have connections to their location. They're not exposed and vulnerable on the road. They're defending known ground with available supplies. Their mortality rate is fraction of refugee mortality rate. This is consistent across all historical collapses. The people who fled died as refugees. The people who stayed survived as residents. Moving seems safer, but it's actually more dangerous. Staying seems dangerous, but it's actually safer. Your intuition is wrong because it's based on peacetime assumptions that don't apply to collapse. What your bug-out plan should actually be. Knowing that bug-out is wrong for most scenarios doesn't mean you have no bug-out plan. It means your plan is specifically for environmental threats, and your default plan for all other scenarios is shelter in place with scenario-specific adaptations. Your bug-out plan is for fire, for flood, for chemical disaster, for nuclear event, for environmental threats, where the location itself is the danger. You have predetermined destination, you have route planned, you have supplies ready, but you only execute this plan for environmental collapse. For economic collapse, your plan is to stay put and develop economic integration. You have skills to trade, you have relationships to leverage, you have strategies for participating in whatever economy emerges. You're not leaving. You're adapting in place. For pandemic collapse, your plan is immediate lockdown where you are. You have supplies to isolate for months. You have protocols to avoid infection. You're not traveling. You're sheltering in place until pandemic passes. For infrastructure collapse, your plan is community organization. You know your neighbors. You have skills that provide value. You're part of collective response to infrastructure failure. You're not fleeing to retreat. You're organizing where you are. For social collapse, your your plan is strategic alignment with whatever power structure emerges or remaining invisible enough to be overlooked. You're not resisting. You're surviving through adaptation to new social order. You're not bugging out to imagined freedom. You're navigating reality. 5 scenarios, 5 different plans. Bug out is only correct for one of them. This is what preparation actually requires, not one universal plan. Scenario-specific strategies that you choose between based on what's actually happening. The bottom line. 4 collapse scenarios, where bugging out gets you killed. Economic collapse, where you need to be where economic activity is happening. Pandemic collapse, where the journey is exposure and isolation in place is protection. Infrastructure collapse, where aid concentrates in population centers and rural areas are unsupported. Social collapse, where cities develop brutal but functional order while rural areas become war zones. One scenario where bugging out saves you. Environmental collapse, where your location becomes uninhabitable and moving away from the environmental threat is survival. The prepper orthodoxy says bug out for any collapse. This gets you killed in 4 out of 5 scenarios. You become refugee when you should be resident. You flee safety for danger. You execute plan designed for one scenario while facing a different one entirely. The correct strategy is scenario recognition followed by scenario-appropriate response. You're evaluating which type of collapse you're facing. You're choosing the strategy that matches. For most collapses, that strategy is shelter in place with specific adaptations. For environmental collapse only, that strategy is immediate evacuation. Your bug-out bag should exist. Your retreat location should be planned. But these are tools for specific scenario, not universal response. Most of your preparation should be for staying put because most collapses require staying, not leaving. The person who survives isn't the one with best bug-out plan. It's the one who recognized which scenario they were in and applied correct strategy. They stayed when staying was right even though leaving felt safer. They sheltered in place through pandemic. They stayed in city through economic collapse. They remained resident instead of becoming refugee. And they executed their bug-out plan only when environmental threat made staying impossible, when fire was coming, when floods were rising, when contamination was spreading, when the environment itself was the threat that required evacuation. Don't bug out by default. Evaluate first. Recognize scenario. Choose appropriate response. Bug out if and only if environmental threat makes your location uninhabitable. Stay for everything else. Because the road is where refugees die. Home is where residents survive. Most collapse scenarios require you to be resident, not refugee. Your survival depends on recognizing which one you should be before you make the decision that determines your fate. Bug out when it's right. Stay when it's wrong. Know the difference. Your life depends on it.